Let's bring on Mike Yoder, and I'm going to talk about some of the violations of the law that took place through COVID, and frankly, what we can do about it, folks. Hey, Mike, thanks for being with us. We don't have your audio. You might need to just go and click and just make sure that the audio is pointing to the right area. There's a settings button, and then go to.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you now. Perfect. I have a bit of an echo, but I'll let you talk. Mike, so you're one of the top constitutional lawyers in the country. You've done some really important work. And I know you have some insights into how COVID, I think you're watching COVID from a different perspective than a lot of us. You're watching COVID from the perspective that really, you're seeing it as kind of a chain of violations of constitutional law, and you're seeing what people can do about it. So tell us the story of COVID from a legal standpoint and the way you've watched it.
Well, interestingly enough, I was working on some COVID-related matters as early as January and February of 2020. And the reason I bring that up is because at the time I was working on completing a joint venture project where there was going to be a health company and a medical company that would have essentially worked together. And we were preparing to have these home antibody tests that were going to be distributed under government grant money, where you would essentially be able to prick your finger or have a drop of blood on a slide. If you have an iPhone 8 or greater or a similar equivalent Android, you'd put that slide on the back of the camera phone. And then after 15 minutes, it would be read, mixed with a drop of solution and transmitted through the app to physicians that would see if the blood blossomed or not. If it had any sort of like polyp or blossom, then that would be positive for antibodies. Obviously, if there was no reaction, then you did not have the antibodies yet. And we knew this as early as 2020 that was going to be one of the most significant indicators of COVID. Yet in April of 2020, that was pulled out from under us. The funding from the government was essentially vacated. And once I realized that this was going to be a political football all the way up through until November. And at the time, I had no idea that I'd be sitting here in August of 2022 still talking about COVID. But I had been very keen to paying attention to the developments and what was going on. And I naturally became very skeptical of what we were being told, because there was no reason, and I still to this day don't have any reason or basis to think that funding should have been pulled when we're sending as much as we are to Ukraine, billions of dollars, when we're just completely wasteful with $85 billion worth of money in terms of what we left in Afghanistan. The funding was de minimis. I mean, it was less than $50 million, which is nothing to the federal government, especially when they just recently passed a bill that somehow you fund inflation to deflate. I mean, it's very paradoxical in and of itself, but I've been very skeptical of it since. And when Biden issued executive orders 14042 and 14043 concerning federal contractors and federal workers, mandating that they receive this non-FDA approved vaccine, and I'm more than happy to talk about that portion too.
Yeah.
That's when I immediately took to Twitter and said that I was going to be filing a lawsuit over this immediately and blocking it, because your rights don't just disappear if you join the military or if you're a federal civilian employee. Your rights don't go anywhere based on what uniform you wear. Now, sure, there could be differences with military versus civilian, things of that nature, where there are some distinct differences, but at the end of the day, your constitutional rights remain constant. And ever since then, it's been an uphill battle, but I've been involved in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, well, and you raised some key points. One that, I mean, they actually had technologies then that could prove if people have antibodies or not. And that would have been pretty significant because, as we know, antibodies to COVID-19 are more robust, more long-lasting than even the vaccine. And frankly, scientific reports are noting this. People are asking why antibodies are not being recognized when it comes to the vaccine mandates. I know early on in Israel, for example, that they were recognizing that as basically being the same as a vaccine. And so why was it not in the United States? That's one big question people had. And as you're noting as well, really they were trying to enforce these laws, including on our military, telling people they have to put something in their bodies they don't want in their bodies, even if it violates their religion. Now, I think people are wondering, like, what can we actually do? Well, I guess 2 points. One, first of all, from your perspective, I mean, how is it that they can restrict legitimate, let's say, proof of immunity while saying that you have to become immune, and even though they've changed even the definition of immunity? How is it they can even do that legally? Is there any legal basis they can use to do that?
Well, the first point I'd like to note is that to have a civilized society is to be ruled by law. The whole notion that we have a legal and a justice system is to maintain civil order and discourse within a nation. I always tell people, if you want to see what happens without laws, read Lord of the Flies. And the issue with that is the law only applies when it's being enforced. It doesn't apply when tyrants are in control. And the mechanism that we have as a buffer between tyranny and civil order is law. But when those in charge and tasked and who take an oath to enforce that law are the individuals responsible for violating it in some of the most egregious fashions, that's where you run into the problem we're running into today. So, very simple. Murder is illegal. Does it stop people from killing one another? Unfortunately, not. And just because something is illegal does not mean that the government is going to restrain itself, as we've seen time and time again for over 2 years now. So, in the sense of whether it's lawful or not, the answer is absolutely not. There's two components to the lawfulness that I want to highlight first, which is one, the informed consent issue, which is whether you can be mandated to inject your body with a non-FDA approved medical product. And the second being, what exceptions are there to being forcibly vaccinated against your will. And as to the EUA issue, it's under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The issue is that under the FDCA, there's no private right of action. The statutory language itself, which was passed by Congress, does not give a citizen the right to file a lawsuit to seek redress as a result of being mandated to take a non-FDA approved medical substance, or in this case, gene therapy. I am hesitant to use the word vaccine because, again, traditional notion of vaccine is a product that provides immunity against a disease, whereas here we clearly know that it does not. So in order for that to happen, one, there would need to be an order or action taken by the Secretary of Health and Human Services to pull the product off of the market under this EUA approval. And secondly, in the event that they refuse to do that, then it would be up to the Department of Justice to prosecute that claim. I can't do that on my own. Just like I can't sue someone for murder. I can't go and criminally charge someone since I'm a civilian attorney. I'm not a member of a state's attorney's office or the Department of Justice or the U.S. Attorney's Office. I likewise have limitations on what I can do. I could sue someone for wrongful death, for example. I could not charge someone with murder. It's just a different body of law. Essentially, I don't have access to the legal vehicle that I would need to be able to hold someone accountable. And again, not just me, any civilian lawyer. The second component is that you have a fundamental right in the First Amendment to freely exercise your religion. And government action that substantially burdens the practice of your religion must pass the strictest constitutional muster possible, which is strict scrutiny. And a lot of words right there to simply say the government can infringe on fundamental rights so long as it's for achieving a compelling governmental interest, meaning this is something the government has to do. Mitigation of COVID-19, that's unquestionably a compelling interest. That was also held in the Brooklyn Catholic Diocese case versus Cuomo. That was something that Gorsuch put in his opinion. I don't think many people quarrel about mitigation measures being a compelling government action. But the second prong of that is that the method or the manner in which they go about effectuating that governmental interest has to be the least restrictive means necessary. Meaning, is there any conceivable way that is less restrictive that can still achieve that same outcome without violating one's rights? And clearly here the answer is yes, because the vaccine doesn't work and they're not abiding by that. So with your religious rights, the only means by which an employer, whether government or private sector, can deny your religious accommodation, and again, you're not requesting an exemption, you're informing them that you're lawfully entitled to an accommodation. And the two bases upon which you can lawfully deny a religious accommodation is if it imposes an undue hardship on the employer, which could either be financial or it could be in the ability or feasibility to actually carry out doing your job, or secondly, if your sincerely held religious beliefs are not in fact sincerely held. So an example of something that would be an undue burden would be, let's say that you work for Department of State and you're a foreign services officer, and your duties and job description literally require you to be present in a different country, let's say in the UK. Well, the UK has a mandate in place that you can't enter the country unless you're vaccinated, which we did go through this as a real example. Well, you could be a cardinal of the Catholic Church. You could, second down from being a pope, and you could be the most entitled person to a religious accommodation, but you can't perform the essential functions of your job because you simply can't get into the country where you need to be in order to work. So that's a situation in which the employer could deny a reasonable accommodation on that specific nuanced ground. Financially, employers are going to have a very difficult time claiming that it's an undue hardship, because there can be a financial burden imposed on the employer. It just can't be an unduly burdensome financial hardship. So that, and the same applies for medical disabilities under the same framework. So long as your physician has a letter stating that you, based on your disability or condition, are more likely, or that the risks of receiving the vaccination outweigh the benefits based on your condition, then employers are obligated to respect that, unless, again, it imposes an undue hardship.
Now, I guess people are wondering then, what can they do? A lot of people, I think, and people ask me all the time, they do feel that their rights are being infringed upon. They feel kind of helpless, honestly, and they don't know where to start. They don't know, do they get involved with the class action? Where do they even find these? Like, what can people do if they feel that their rights are being infringed?
Well, I think one of the first things is something that has to be done internally, which is putting your head in the right school of thought, or getting your mind wrapped around what's going on right now. Because so many people that I run into, and it's both Republican and Democrat that I run into, that I genuinely believe that the vast majority of people that are Democrat are good people, the vast majority of Republicans are good people. The problem is that if you are that good person and someone does something wrong to you, you naturally presume that they're like you and that it was an accident or that it was a mistake, and then you give them the benefit of the doubt. So you sort of adopt this turn the other cheek mentality. Meanwhile, in doing so, you're going to get trampled again, and they're going to push you back harder, because what we fell into is this complacency of just being inferior and submissive to what we're told without any basis. So we draw our line in the sand, and as soon as they encroach on it, we just continually back it up. We keep moving our goalposts backwards. So the first thing that anyone can do is stand your ground. I tell people all the time, draw your line in the sand, that line, that proverbial line being your fundamental rights. Draw that line, accept and realize that you are not selfish for exercising rights that are given to you under the Constitution of this country, and enforce them, and you push back. Now, a lot of people have a lot to lose, and I'm not going to speak as to the subjective nature that everyone has different skin in the game in terms of whether they can or cannot afford to lose their employment. But I would challenge each person that's using that as a basis to submit. If you do have sincerely held religious beliefs, I would trust that those beliefs are probably more valuable to you than working. And secondly, if you have a health condition, why would you compromise your health to work when, if you do injure yourself, or in some cases have severe adverse effects, you can't work at all to provide for your family, period. So it's drawing that line in the sand and prioritizing what is most important to you, which is your health and upholding your religious beliefs and your faith. Second of all is not compromising or wavering. And third of all is keeping your job. And what you do is you push back and resist, which fortunately we've had enough people do that now that a lot of the mandates are falling, by just simply saying no and standing your ground. I give people, I do a lot of constitutional law courses. I do workshops online for $100 that I just will teach an entire class on constitutional law. I'll give people templates. I'll give them documents. I teach them how to go through the EEOC proceedings, where if they do discriminate or violate your rights, you can simply file the challenges, either going through the EEO counselor if you're a federal worker, or going to the EEOC if you're in the private sector, and filing discrimination claims challenging the unconstitutionality of this. We just had in Chicago, we just saw that there was a hospital that denied 520 religious accommodations to healthcare workers wrongfully There's a class action filed, and the hospital just settled for $10.3 million because they wrongfully denied these accommodations. We've seen service members pushing back against their board of inquiries. There is a method and a mechanism to challenge this and fight back. It's just whether A, people are willing to undergo and undertake that. And secondly, the other thing is finding the information that you need, which of course I try to disseminate as much as possible, but there just aren't a lot of lawyers stepping up in this fight.